come into your presence. Thank you for your perfect wisdom, power, and love. If we stand naked but for a moment at the foot of your cross, we know our sins are manifest and our judgments are flawed. Even while we rejoice in your abundant grace and mercy, we continue to seek our own way instead of your way. Thank you for graciously ignoring the details of our petitions. You already know what we need to draw ever closer to you. Your plan, your way, this day, every day. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Roger. Okay. Bob's going to mute everybody.
You need to unmute, Jana.
There we go. If you've attended church this morning already, you've seen there's a little sign on the overhead that talks about the history of Mother's Day. And not until I started getting emails this week from various blogs that I'm on about the history of Mother's Day, I did not realize it started in the Methodist Church. So yay for us. There was a lady named Anna Jarvis, and she wanted to recognize her mother, Anne, who was a very well-known person during the Civil War when she would help administer nursing services to the soldiers on both sides of the line. And she was also a peace activist. So Anna wanted to honor her mother. So she started in 1907, and it took 7 years, not till 1914, where Woodrow Wilson was able to proclaim that the second Sunday in May would be set aside to honor Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day to all of you. And Anna was no dummy. She saw the writing on the wall and hated and despised all the commercialization that started immediately when Mother's Day was proclaimed. So she really wanted people just to write a note to their mother thanking them. That's all she really wanted, but we know it's gotten much bigger than that. So when Bill and Phyllis were on their trip, which I think they're still on, but you're here in person, Bill asked if I could lead a discussion today on Mother's Day and how mothers in the Bible affect us and the qualities of the mothers in the Bible. So, you know me, I'm a data person. So I started asking a bunch of my friends, hey, I have to do this Sunday school lesson. Oh, excuse me, I get to do this Sunday school lesson. And what mother of the Bible comes to mind when I ask you, what mother in the Bible is important to you? Almost to a T, everybody said, Mary, mother of Jesus. And I said, well, you know, that's probably been talked about enough. And I think we can go a little bit further. What's the next most important? The next one they said was Sarah. So I just kind of looked around at different mothers in the Bible and I just picked 3. God said, pick these 3 and let's just talk about them. And I think that the 3 we're going to talk about all have good and bad attributes that we can learn from, mothers and fathers alike. So we're going to lead this discussion today, and I've chosen 3 people to kind of give us a short story about the mother that we're going to talk about, and then we'll do some discussion after that. So thank you for the 3 ladies that said yes to my question and volunteered to enlighten us on these mothers. So the first one we're going to talk about, Joyce is going to lead us. She's going to sit close to the microphone there, so I hope everybody can hear her, but she's going to talk about Jochebed, the mother of Miriam, Aaron, and Moses.
I think I should go up closer.
Once you test from where you are, ask her if you can hear.
Can you see me okay and hear me
Yes.
okay, Jen?
Yes,
Okay.
that's good.
Okay, I'll stay right here then. Good morning, and I have a story to tell you. It's about Jochebed, the mother of Moses. Let's just start with a quick review of what Moses did accomplish, where you'll have a better understanding of who Jochebed really is. He led the Jews out of slavery. He led them through the Red Sea into the Holy Land. He also gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and it was believed he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And Jochebed, so he, as you can see, had many accomplishments. So his mother, Jochebed, was very outstanding. She was not only Moses' mother, but Aaron and Miriam's mother too. Jochebed was pregnant when Pharaoh ordered all newborn Hebrew males be killed. Pharaoh was fearful that Hebrew males would take over his throne. In Exodus 1:22, and Janet really gave me 2 and 6 out of Hebrews, but it said he ordered, meaning Pharaoh, he ordered the newborn babies to be thrown into the Nile at their birth. And it was filled with crocodiles and poisonous snakes. And I said, yikes. Can you imagine how Jochebed must have felt? I can't even imagine myself. Jochebed saw her baby boy was a fine child. He was special. And isn't that what most of us mothers feel when our babies were born? She and her husband, Amrad, hid him for 3 months. He was a happy boy and very joyful. And he was afraid, they were afraid he was going to be hurt and taken from their home and killed. So Jochebed made a very special basket for him that was waterproof. She was so smart. She took him to the Nile and placed him among the reeds where she knew the wealthy people came to bathe. What a great faith she had to believe that God would take care of her Moses. Along came Pharaoh's daughter, also known as Queen Bithiah, to bathe in the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and heard crying. She asked the slave girl to go get it. She saw the Hebrew baby, and when she saw him, her heart was filled with compassion. Miriam, Moses' older sister, was watching from a safe distance and asked if she could get a Hebrew mother to nurse the baby. And Queen Bithiah said, yes, go find one and I will pay her. So Miriam ran and got her mother, of course, and God brought Jochebed's child right back to her. What a happy Mother's Day that must have been. During these years of caring for Moses, Jochebed was able to instill in Moses about the love of God and faith in God. She taught him to love the Lord with all his heart. We as parents and grandparents have the opportunity to pour into our children and grandchildren. And they think that he returned to to Pharaoh's daughter when he was about 4 or 5, which would make sense about weaning the child at that time. But some scholars even think he could have been as old as 10 to 12 when he was returned to Pharaoh's daughter. So the value of a faithful mother such as Jochebed is truly invaluable. We too need faithful women who will live courageously in our present time, who will invest in their children and grandchildren. That's all.
Great, great. Thank you, Joyce. That's a great story and a great aspect of looking at mothers from the viewpoint that you just gave us. So I'm going to ask some questions. You're going to have to unmute if you raise your hand and unmute so we can listen to everybody. But I want some discussion here on what qualities did Jochebed demonstrate that were godly qualities?
Could y'all hear me back there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have a loud voice.
It sounds muted if anybody wants to speak.
Carol does.
Yes, Carol.
I think faith comes to my mind.
Okay.
Faith.
Faith. Yes, definitely faith.
And I think love over your child versus yourself.
That's important. Did anybody think she was brave?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
You know, sometimes in motherhood, mothers like to hold on. That's the thing we like to do. We like to hold on to our kids. But she knew the importance of trusting God and letting go. So I don't know about y'all, but I think a lot of people here have had children go to college. And when our firstborn was getting ready to go, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. Chris said, we got to change his room. We got to take that stuff out of his room because that's going to be the guest room after he leaves. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I was hanging on as much as much as I could, but he was a great dad, and he helped them and helped him pick out new paint for his room. He helped him pick out new bedspread for his bed. And we still call it Todd's room, but it's really guest room number 1. But I did not want to let go. So can you imagine letting go of a newborn, 3-month-old, putting him in a river with who knows what kind of animals, not knowing what's going to happen to him? So letting go is something that's mothers aren't really easy to do. We're not easy in letting go. We want to hang on, even when they're grown and gone and married and have kids of their own. We still want to hang on to them. But I think that Jochebed, not only being brave and faithful, but that woman had a plan, and that plan helped her in her faith. And so those of us that are planners can really appreciate that. I think she had faith that her plan was going to work out, and it did work out. She came back and was paid to watch her baby. Now that's kind of unusual this day and age. But I think she had peace in knowing that God loved her child more than she did. And he was going to protect that child because he had big plans, for Moses. But her faith allowed her to see the importance of following through with her plan. One thing that struck me, there's a verse in Hebrews that talks about, well, let me just read it. Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Well, what do you think about that? You think not being afraid was something easy for them? No, I don't think it was. I think being afraid would have been the first thing that I would have jumped to. But both of them, the mother and the father, were not afraid of his edict. So the father also had a lot of faith in the plan that Jochebed was hatching there. She had faith that her baby boy was going to be in God's hands, and that sure enough, as Joyce has told us, he grew up to be a great leader of Israel. So if you step back from that story and you do the what if, which I know is a very dangerous thing to do in a lot of circumstances, is what would have happened if she didn't have all that faith?
We wouldn't have Moses.
Moses. Yeah, a lot of stuff happened after Moses became as important as he was. So a lot of, like Joyce said, 5 books of the Bible were devoted and probably written by him. So we wouldn't have that. There's a lot of things that dominoed after Moses. So this was a very important plan and a big leap of faith for Jochebed to honor God in the way that she did. Nobody thinks it was easy, and being a mother, it would not have been easy for me either. But what's more astonishing to me is after 3, 5, 10 years, depending on which scholar you follow, she gave him back and said, okay, gave her back to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter raised her. But as Joyce said, that little bit of time at the beginning of his life, Jochebed, we believe Jochebed really did instill those faith qualities in God in him. They tell you that children that are little have the most absorption of information, and that the development of the characters of the child happens very, very, very early. So to me, this story tells us that we should trust God when times get tough. And they were tough for her. Bill, you're going to add something here.
I wanted to add that I think what you're saying is really important to me, because I've noticed over the years that a lot of mothers carry a lot of guilt a lot of mothers, maybe all mothers, feel like they could have done a better job. A lot of mothers feel like they did a horrible job. And, you know, the more I look at this story, it reminds me of how a little means a lot. And that is, it's so much like our Lord taught us that, you know, maybe you're like she was, you don't have but just a short time, maybe just a few months to do what you can with this baby. Maybe you don't have resources. Maybe you had to work a couple of jobs. Maybe the children you have were not, you know, they weren't easy. All kind of things happen to mothers. But if you just do a little in the name of the Lord, it can have a huge repercussion down the road. So I just wanted to say a word to encourage all the mothers who are realists. And that is Mother's Day has a way of Hallmark cardish that either you are the perfect mother that it's kind of like a funeral. Everything about you is perfectly wonderful. And if you're anything less, you're just this horrible creature and God's mad at you and the whole world's screwed up because of you, and your children are, everything they do wrong is because you. I think that's such a big lie, that here's this woman who didn't really have much to give, didn't have much time to give it, and yet it made a difference. So whatever you've done for your children or your adopted children or people you work with in school or Sunday school, it means a lot. And I just want to say I'm grateful to all of you who had some little part in somebody's life. But just want to throw, I hope, a little bit of sunlight on a subject that's pretty hard for a lot of people.
Thank you, Bill. Before we move on to the next mother of the Bible, I want to ask Joyce, what part of this story struck you the most?
It was really how courageous she was. And when I said that part, when I read that part about she looked at him and saw he was fine, and that I looked that up and it said it meant beautiful. And but she also somehow sensed he had a special role down the road, so to speak. And so I don't know, to me, that was the very most important part. I tried to weave a few of those words into my story that were characteristics. I knew that Janet was going to ask y'all that, and see how many picked up on all of that. And so that to me was what made the biggest impression. This is what Charlie gave me when we got married 12 years ago. And I can hardly carry it anymore because you can see it's very worn out from so many years of BSF for you BSFers in here. But it's so cool because there was even as I read, chapter 2 in Exodus, there's a whole page on Jochebed in here. And all important, if you've never had this Bible, doesn't have a concordance really, like, at the bottom or anything, but it's a great, to read about these mothers. So anyway, thank you, Janet, for
Thank you,
asking
Joyce.
me.
That was great. Okay, the next mother I picked might be kind of unusual to a lot of you, but I picked Rebecca, and Sherry graciously said, okay, well, we'll see what we can do with Rebecca. So she's going to give a little story about Rebecca, and then we'll talk about Rebecca. Thank you, Sherry.
Sure. I thought this was a little odd too. So I wish I had Joyce's book. I have never studied this passage in depth. So here we go. Rebecca's story is very early in the Bible. It is right in the middle of Genesis. So I mean, the very, very beginning of the Bible. So here we go. I think Rebecca's story is pretty much a soap opera. She's young and very beautiful. She's brought in by Abraham's servant to marry Isaac, Abraham's son. Now he's a bit older, but he's very wealthy. He's rich. So they fall in love, they marry, and they hope for many kids. And it's years and years, and they aren't able to have any kids. So Isaac prays to God that they can have children. And it comes true. So 20 years after they're married, she's able to have a child, children, and she has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Now Esau is the eldest and ends up being Isaac's favorite son, and Jacob is the younger and ends up being Rebekah's favorite son. Now God tells Rebekah that the sons are the heads of two different nations that will never get along. And he also tells her that the younger son will reign over the older son, which is just totally against the laws back then. So the kids grow up and Isaac gets older, nearly blind, and he decides he's going to give Esau his blessing, the family blessing where he give him all the money, the wealth, head of the family. Well, Rebekah overhears this and she's like, and so she gets this scheme to go so that Jacob, they're going to trick Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing, the younger son. And they're successful. They do this. Well, when Esau finds out, he is mad. He is really mad and threatens to kill Jacob. So then Rebekah has to send Jacob, or does send Jacob, to the uncle's house to stay to keep him safe. So the whole thing is a crazy plan by Rebekah in the long run, even though she knew that was God's plan. I have a hard time figuring out. I mean, she deceived her husband. She lied. She cheated her eldest son out of his rightful blessing. But yet, through all of this, even though it was a crazy story, God's will was done. And what he said is what happened. So.
Okay, so my question to you, to everybody is, did they model any Christ-like behavior in this story?
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough one. How she did it, I don't know whether it was one of those things like happens to me where you go, Lord, I got this. I'll take care of this. I'm going to handle this. I'm going to make it happen just like what you want it to happen, you know?
Yeah, so there's a lot of crazy things in this story. And the story right before this one, which I didn't ask you to review, is when Esau and Jacob had a little battle somewhat, where Esau came in and was hungry and Jacob was the cook and was making a stew, and they negotiated a birthright exchange in that one.
Right.
So I think one of the big things that was a problem in this family that's very dysfunctional is the parents took sides. They had favorites. And if you ask anybody, well, I do this to my mom just to kind of see what kind of answer I get out of her, because her dementia's gotten pretty bad. And I go visit her and I say, well, Mom, which of the 4 children were your favorites? And she goes, oh, all of y'all were my favorites. So even in her mind, she's still thinking, oh, I don't have a favorite, So the family itself did not function very well. And so the birthright and the blessing exchanges that were put on by that whole family was just not something that seemed like a model of Christ to me at all. And on top of that, I don't think Esau and Jacob even liked each other, because of the way you see in the story how they kind of get at each other in a way where one of them is telling, like Jacob is saying, well, give me your birthright if you want some stew. So I don't know where Rebekah was in that part of the story, but I think maybe she could have handled that a little differently if she was even around then. Can you imagine your son coming in? All of you probably have had this experience before, where your kid comes in and they say, I'm starving. If you don't feed me, I'm going to die. That's kind of Esau. That's kind of Esau's tactic in there. And just trying to negotiate something, and then Jacob coming back and saying, well, give me your birthright and I'll give you some stew. So we talk about birthright there, but when you're talking about, Sherry, the blessing, those two are kind of different things. A birthright typically is something that you inherit, like from your family, your parents. The blessing is something that you earn as a merit that your in this case, the father would give the child. Well, when I think of a blessing, I don't think of a blessing in the sense that Jacob earned it, but he's fulfilling what God had said was going to happen. The verses that you were referring to, Sherry, I'm going to read those so everybody understands. So this is out of Genesis chapter 25 and verse 23. It says, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So she's asking God, and this is his response when the twins were battling each other while they were still in the womb. So maybe at this point, the fulfillment of what God said was going to happen happens in the blessing, even though looking at the story, you wouldn't think Jacob would have earned the blessing. But what also intrigued me was that Rebecca said, I got this, I'll figure this out. And you've all heard the term or the phrase that you just dig yourself in a deeper hole when you start lying. And that's, I think, exactly what she was doing. She was just getting herself in a deeper hole with all this. And her husband was evidently going along with it until the story you're talking about, Sherry, where he's, kind of on his deathbed and he wants to pass on his blessing to his child. So I see Jacob modeling her behavior in his actions there. And because God had picked him to further on his legacy among his peoples, that I see that the Jacob story here is kind of odd to me. But if you go back to the verses that God had told Rebecca when they were still in the womb, it looks to me like he's trying to keep that fulfillment. So I have a question about that. So even though Jacob was deceitful, why would God bless a deceitful person? Any ideas?
Oh, Janet, this is Roger. I think that God always blesses imperfect people. Always has, always will. And it doesn't matter if the person doesn't meet a certain standard, because God will use him or her in his plan. Now, if we wait, we sometimes, just like Bill said, we kind of set a standard for mothers that's unrealistic. I think we set a standard for anyone that's unrealistic, because we all are flawed, and yet God can certainly and will use us.
Very good. I agree with you there, that God's grace and his blessing are always available to the undeserving, and the unexpected. So his choice was made even before Esau and Jacob were born. And so it wasn't based on their merit, but that just exactly what you said, Roger, tells us that God blesses all of us, even when we are deceitful, even when we do lie, even when Rebecca said, I got this. We're gonna make this work. I got it. And she knowing that what she was doing was not godlike or not Christ-like. So when all of us have seen families, or maybe in your own family, seen where deceitful things happen. And it's very hard for us to look at those people and not be judgmental. So whoever was looking at Rebecca, Isaac, and their son, I'm sure were being judgmental in their day and time in their own way. But instead, we should be looking at them and offering up prayer that they overcome their dysfunctionality in whatever way possible, so that they can see that the faith that they do have in Christ is really shown in their actions. Some of you wear these bracelets, these fisherman bracelets, and we have at times have come across people and we look at them and we just kind of get to know them a little bit, and we finally say, tell me about your bracelet. And they change their demeanor because they're now focused on the faith that bracelet represents to them, their faith in God. Even if they might have been acting ungodlike in a situation, when we look at that bracelet and we ask them about it, their whole demeanor changes. If any of y'all have had that happen to you, you understand what I'm talking about. I also wear a bracelet that said, what would Jesus do? And some people, that's pretty obvious because you can read that one. The other one doesn't have any words on it. And I had a guy at work ask me one time, I've been working with this gentleman for several years, and he said, tell me about your fisherman bracelet. Do you fish? So we went into this little discussion, and when I finally got my 3-minute elevator speech done with him, he understood why I wore it and appreciated it. So we have to remember Rebecca's story is very hard for us to understand because everything about it seems so wrong. And how could a woman of her faith have that kind of personality and go through everything that she did with her children and her husband, and then come out with this son, Jacob, that is also, like Moses, very important person in the Bible. So if you haven't read Rebecca's story, I encourage you to go to those chapters in Exodus and read through it. It's very shake your head. Okay, I am glad the story's in there, because as Bill said earlier, all of us aren't perfect. And if an imperfect person like Rebecca and her family can be that important in the legacy of God in the Bible, then we all can do the same thing. So she risked deception, but she did follow in the end God's promise. And so despite the good or bad choices we make, the thing that came out to me is that God is sovereign. He's going to love us anyway, and he's going to protect us, and we're just going to still look to him for guidance. Did anybody else have any comments about Rebecca? Yes, Phyllis?
I think there's a little bit of a side lesson here for me, maybe for somebody else. If you look at the culture in which they lived, the culture itself had set up a situation about the inheritance and the blessing and how all that was to be done, and these parents were going according to their culture. And we know from parenting that sometimes our parenting is influenced so much by the culture. And I think this is a reminder that maybe we should kind of ignore the culture sometime and really pay attention to God's way about things. And I've seen this, and I'm sure you all have too. You've seen this whole inheritance thing that's still with us. I've seen so many families get really crosswise with each other about that topic. So I think it really behooves us to really look at the culture and see if it lines up with God's way about things.
Exactly. And oh, go ahead, Bill.
I want to add to what Phyllis was saying, is that I've always loved this story. I agree with Sherry. It's sort of a Bible soap opera. And it's like so many families that I've dealt with in my life that look so awful, with so many bad decisions. But at the same time, you know, I think it's a tremendous story of hope. And that is, out of the worst garbage heap of a family life comes sometimes wonderful kids. And I think it's a story of hope for everybody who did not have a wonderful mother and dad. It's a wonderful story of hope for all of us who know people who grew up with a lot of negative stuff, and yet there's maybe something that went on in that family that was good. So I think it's like in talking to my brother, who's not yet a believer, we talk regularly, and one of the things he's always hated about the Christian faith is the hypocrisy, which we all hate. But this story is this is the kind of story I like to tell my brother, who says, I say, you know, the Bible is not a Cinderella book. The Bible is very realistic and talks about people that God loved, but they were pretty trashy, pretty bad, pretty miserable people. And he likes the fact that, you know, that God cares, because I think he sees himself as somebody who's messed up a lot. The other thing I like about it is that I found that people who are really messed up, they need to know that there are people who messed up, and yet maybe there's something good about them. Have you found that if you find somebody who's really an addict, who feels like I am worthless, I'm no good, I'm going to take my life, and so you begin to say, look, let's just see what is there about your life that is good. So we look at this woman. I think there's some things that we could see. If you look closely, there's some things about her, even with her bad, most of her stuff bad. Isn't there something about her that's good? I mean, that she really did want the best. She's trying to follow the rules like Phyllis talked. Maybe we need to be grateful for the little things that are there that maybe actually worked. So just a thought, Janet.
Well, before we move on, I want to ask Sherry one. Thank you, Sherry, for the story. But what in this story struck you the most?
I guess it was just there was so much that went on, but yet it all worked to the good of God. I mean, Jacob was a wonderful leader, and you know, like Bill said, he was just a wonderful child, and there was a lot of love in the family. They did love each other. They loved the boys. They just had trouble, I guess, showing it, to be honest. So it was an interesting story. It was good.
That's good. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, the last mother of the Bible we're going to talk about is Hannah. And I've asked Sylvia, she could give us a little synopsis about the Hannah story.
Good morning, everybody. Hannah's story deals with infertility, bullying, answered prayer, and it reaches prophetically into the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it was common for men to have more than one wife. Hannah was one of two women married to a man named Elkanah. She had no children, but his other wife, Peninnah, had many. And Peninnah didn't let Hannah forget that either. She constantly picked on Hannah about not having children, although Hannah's husband, Elkanah, loved her deeply and wasn't bothered at all that Hannah was barren. Every year when the family went to worship, Elkanah would give meat to his wives and children to sacrifice. He gave twice as much meat to Hannah because he loved her, even though God had closed her womb. This drove his other wife crazy, and she provoked Hannah even more. It really upset Hannah, and she cried and she couldn't eat. This went on for years, but Hannah never retaliated to Peninnah. She just prayed to the only one who could alleviate the problem, the Lord her God. One year at worship, she was so anguished and miserable. She was weeping bitterly, and she prayed fervently to God to give her a son. She even made a vow. If God gave her a son, she would give him to the Lord forever. While she was crying and praying, one of the priests saw her and actually accused her of being drunk, told her to get off the bottle. She replied to him that she hadn't even been drinking. She said she was just so grief-stricken and that she was pouring out her soul to the Lord. Meanwhile, the priest's father, Eli, saw all of this play out, and he told Hannah to go home in peace because God was going to grant her her wish. Immediately, Hannah was uplifted. Her faith allowed her to believe it, and she went home smiling. And sure enough, she became pregnant soon afterwards and gave birth to a son she named Samuel. She had every intention of keeping her vow to the Lord to return Samuel to him. So she loved and nursed him and weaned him and prepared him and herself for the day when he was weaned, she would literally give him to God. After he was weaned, she returned to the house of the Lord and presented her boy to Eli, saying, I prayed for this child, and the Lord granted what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. She was actually leaving her son there permanently, and she was happy about it. Hannah had several more children after that, but this was her defining moment for sure. In following through on her promise to dedicate Samuel to God's service, she discovered that the greatest joy in having a child is to give that child fully and freely back to God. She entered motherhood prepared to do what all mothers must eventually do, let go of their children. Finally, I have one last observation about Hannah. There's something prophetic in her story. Hannah gave her firstborn son's life to God in love and honor. And we see her actions foreshadow God's. Because of God, the Father's love for us, he gave his first and only son's life to restore our honor.
Perfect. Thank you, Sylvia. I'm sure all of us have read the Hannah story before. A couple of things that struck me with her story, with what's going on in our world today, is bullying and infertility. I'm sure all of us know, if it's not within our own family, we have friends that have, children that want to have children. And it's just gotten to a point where you're not going to be able to avoid hearing a story about somebody's infertility. But the bullying part of what Hannah had to put up with, to me, was something that we still see today, even more so with our social media going on. But what happened when Hannah was bullied? What did she do?
Well, she
Anybody?
didn't strike back. She didn't. She really just turned her other cheek and just was even more prayerful to God.
Right. She turned to God. She didn't get caught up in the bullying aspect of it, although it must have been very difficult for her. But one thing that I noticed during the bullying phase, when she was really adamant about turning to God, was, I'm pretty sure her husband was right by her. We see in the story where he gives her twice as much food. He's watching her reactions. He's watching her emotions, and he is really helping her. And so when we come across people that we know are bullied, what's the first thing we want to do? We want to go be by their side, right? We want to say, you're good. You're not who these people tell you you are. But I think that's an important part of the story for me, is that the bullying part was just something that I, as a Christian, I can't tolerate the bullying part. So we have to be very careful with that when we approach that in our daily lives. The other thing she did that we all do, everybody's going to fess up to this, and I hope you have a story, is when things weren't going right for her, what did she do? In her prayer, she started what? Making promises to God. And what promise did she make? She's going to give that child back to him. So she started the bargaining. So have any of y'all been in a situation where you were bargaining with God for something that was happening to you or not happening to you? Okay, well, I'll start up a story. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a friend of mine. Back in the 1980s, this colleague at work and his wife and his family were in Colorado, and they were staying at some family cabin, and the kids stayed behind with the grandparents, and the parents of the children got on their snowmobile and went for a snowmobile ride. During their ride, a crazy, horrible snowstorm came through, and they were in whiteout conditions, and they could not find their way back to the cabin. And so they parked their snowmobile, dug a hole in the snow to make a cave, and they both got in it. And they were in there for over 14 hours before somebody could find them. And so there was an article in the paper about it. But when the guy came back to work, several weeks later, I went and talked to him. And I said, what happened? I want to know why they were out there, but that wasn't my question. I said, what were you doing for 14 hours? And he said, I was bargaining with God. I promised him everything. I just wanted to see the faces of my children again. And so he was at a really desperate point, because that was like life or death for him. But we bargain with God, not in life and death situations sometimes. We just bargain with him. Oh, if you do, I'll do this if you do this, kind of thing. And so I think her bargaining was something more of the humanity part of her to me. But I think she was very sincere about it. And of course, what happened? She followed up on her bargaining. She came through her desperation, and she promised God that she would give her child back to him. Now, as a mother or a father, that could not have been an easy thing to do. And so her dedication and her selflessness and what she did and what she continued to do was so good for us, because what happened? Well, Samuel became another one of those godly men at the early part of the Bible in the stories. And just like Moses was somebody that was really going to be a great leader, for Israel. So the third point I'm going to make in that story, to me, was she got so desperate that her crying and her pleading and her praying to God affected her emotionally and physically, where the other priest looked at her and thought she was drunk. I have seen people in that situation before, where they're just inconsolable in their prayer with whatever situation they're in, that it just overcomes them. And if you've ever seen somebody like that, it has an effect on you. So I am sure everybody else around her was really observing her, trying to understand where she was coming from. And I'm hoping that her faith in that moment gave a witness to those other people, and what was happening to her and what her prayer life was like at that point. So probably like 3 years old, she takes Samuel back and gives him to the priest to be raised. Now, how many of you have 3-year-old grandchildren? Could you let them go 3 years old? Doesn't ever say whether she sees him every day or not, but they're under the care of the priest. So I'm imagining that, yes, she's got to be involved in his life somehow, but the Bible doesn't tell us that part. Maybe Bill, and your knowledge of the other references of the Bible can shed some light on that. But for a mother, she was doing it for God because that was her promise to him. And for his faith and letting her get pregnant, that's what she had to do. Now, he did bless her. She had 3 other sons and 2 daughters after that. But your firstborn is so different than the rest of your children. You can't tell me they're not, because it's the first, and the first is always important. So God did favor her with additional children, and all of them brought blessings to her life. So that's the story of Hannah. It's a really good ending. It's a story of a woman that was at the low of lows, that came out really high in her request for having a child, and that she knew that God had blessed her, and she wanted to make sure that her blessing from God was given back to him in the way of his child. Does anybody have any comments more about Hannah or any Hannah stories? No. Bill, do you know anything more about Hannah after she gave the child up?
I don't,
Okay.
but I sure do admire her and her integrity for following through with this bargain that she made. 'Cause I think it would have been, after she'd had the child and nourished him for so long, that it would have been so easy for her to just say, just kidding, God, maybe you forgot, maybe I can just keep it. And she was true to her promise.
Yeah. And it shouldn't baffle any of us, but I'm pretty sure she prayed for that child every day afterwards. So it's a situation that it is a faith-filled woman that was given a blessing and that she used the blessing as she had promised. So kudos to her. A wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that, Sylvia.
You're welcome.
Does anybody in the in-person class have any stories they can share?
I am on.
Tim does.
Okay, Tim.
Some of you may have heard this before, but I have 2 stories about the Fisherman's Bracelet.
Okay.
I was in the valley doing a monitoring visit to a public school in the valley. And as we were sitting around the table, I noticed that several people in the group had fisherman's bracelets. When we were through talking, one of them came over and asked me, "Where did you get your bracelet? Where did you go to Axe?" Well, I told her I went to Emmaus, but I realized you're in the valley. This is Catholic country. And the woman said, "Well, at least we know you'll be fair." Boy, I gotta live up to that. One other time I was in Edgewood ISD. I was in one of the middle schools or whatever you want to call them nowadays. And I didn't realize that, so I'm measuring, I'm also there to take a look at the building, make sure it's in compliance with ADA. And so I'm in this basement, and that's where the library is. And the librarian comes up to me and he says, "I see you have one of those fisherman's bracelets." And I said, "Yes, I went to Untitled, but I'm not wearing it today." But anyway, and he told me about it, but he hadn't been to Axe and he hadn't been to Emmaus, either one. He just liked the bracelet. And as I'm leaving, he stops me from across the room and he raises his hand and he goes, "Fisherman bracelet from," what's that?
James Avery.
James Avery. He goes, "Fisherman's bracelet, James Avery." So I raised my own, I went, "Fisherman's bracelet, Walmart." I just used, the swivel, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, that's my bracelet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Tim.
Well, Janet, this is Ann. I have it's not really a story. Well, it's a story that I've heard about a woman who had maybe 10 children, and her pastor asked her one day, he said, "You must have favorites. Tell me, who's your favorite? You have all those children, you have to have a favorite." And she said, and I think this was true for me, because I have 3, and I think he said, she said, "Whichever one needs me the most is my favorite at that time. But the one that's sick, the one that's hurting, the one that's in trouble, that's the one I love the most." And I think that's true with us, with most of our children.
Thank you, Ann. That's a great story. I
I
think
have a
there's
quick
lot of truth
story
in
about that. I got a similar story. A friend of mine I used to work with has a son and 3 daughters, and the son turned 13 recently, and the mom posted something on Facebook and said something about it was her favorite son. And I wrote back to her, of all your sons, he's also my favorite. And she wrote back that she tells him that he has to listen carefully of whether he says, "You're my favorite son," or "You're my favorite son."
Well, I have enjoyed talking with you today. I've enjoyed all your stories. Thank you, ladies. Joy, Mary, Sylvia, Roger, thank you for the prayer. I hope everyone has a great Mother's Day, and we'll look forward to next week. So Les, I think I'm passing the baton back to you.
Great job, Janet.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, for all the work you put into this and just the great class you gave us today.
You're welcome.
Yes, and the three ladies that spoke also.
Mhm.
Thank you all for sharing. Yeah, we have 33 people today. You're a big attraction, Janet.
Great. Well, I think all the mothers are coming. Thank you.
So we will see y'all next Sunday then.
Okay, happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's
Take care.
Day.
Happy Mother's Day.
Thank you.
Really nice shot.